Justus Latham, Director of the Duke Center for International Development.
Ed Skloot, would you know?
Joel Fleischman,
I know.
Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy.
Take it away, Alan.
Well, let me speak for a little while to try to get the proverbial ball rolling and then make sure we have plenty of time to hear from all of you. I want to begin with some lines of William Carlos Williams that I like to quote. He says, "It's hard to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for want of what's found there." You may have been told when I was asked to give a title to my intervention here, I said, "How will you know?" And what I'd like to talk about a little is how will you know about things like impact and effectiveness. And I begin by quoting William Carlos Williams because there are lots of ways of knowing. And poems teach one things that might even be thought to be relevant to the activity of philanthropy. And poems can have impact and can be effective, but not in perhaps the traditional ways we use those terms. So I want to begin by insisting that, of course, there are many different kinds of philanthropy requiring different kinds of approaches. And I come at this from one particular angle, and it's not the only angle. But my own background is in higher education. And so naturally that has a lot to do with the way I think about these things. And if I were to compare my life in higher education with my life now at a large foundation, I'm often asked, well, isn't it more fun to be giving it away than asking for it? And isn't it, being on this side of the table as opposed to that side of the table? My view of that is that they have profound things in common, at least if you think about philanthropy and university administration in the way that I do. I always supposed that as president of the university, it was my job to listen for other people's good ideas and then try to help them find the resources with which to realize those good ideas. And I think that's exactly what I do as president of a foundation. My job and the job of my colleagues is to listen for other people's good ideas and then to try to provide some resources with which they can realize those ideas. Because neither the president of the university nor the president of the foundation can have all the good ideas. And in an age in which we like to talk a lot about strategic plans and strategic directions, things of the sort, we're getting out of making toasters and we're going into financial services. Universities don't really work that way in my view, and I don't think any president of a very good university gets to do things like that and oughtn't to want to try. What you need to do is find talented people and then listen for their good ideas and then try to help them realize those ideas. So the central administration is a service organization in my view. It's a question of finding good people and then enabling them to succeed. And especially in a large university like Duke or Cornell or the University of Chicago, there's no way for one or even a very few people in the middle to have all the good ideas that it takes to make the university successful. So I like to think then that the world of philanthropy does have room for something that is more like listening than like making a strategic plan and marching after some particular goal. Part of the issue, I think, is, and here mind you, I don't wish to speak critically of anybody and anyone's approach to philanthropy. I just want to say there is space in this world for lots of different ways of going about it. One of the things that afflicts us, I think, in this world, as in many domains of our activity these days is the great temptation to think of everything in the way that economists think about things. Now, if you've read Freakonomics and some other books like that, you'll understand, of course, that there are many things about human life that can reasonably be thought about in the way that economists think about them. Some sort of unusual things. In fact, it's not only about applied mathematics. But if you set out to use the tools of an economist, then you're bound to concentrate on certain kinds of things that the economist's tools are good for. And you may overlook things that don't lend themselves to the use of those tools. So in every field, every academic field, you show up every morning hauling a big toolkit. And it's the nature of the tools in that toolkit that determines what you study and how you study it. And that toolkit can blind you to many other things worth studying. In the field of music history, it's that toolkit was full of German tools. The people who invented musicology were German philologists. And so when I was in graduate school, that's what we learned. We learned how to do manuscript studies, and we learned how to do a certain kind of music theory and analysis that was perfect for the study of German music. And guess what? The music of France and Spain and Italy was all seen to be in the textbooks. They said peripheral. And you would read the great history of Western music. I mean, literally, the textbooks were organized this way. You'd read. Medieval music was important because it was very good for philology. And then you'd get on the train and it was, Handel and Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Wagner and Brahms and then the peripheral countries, a couple of chapters at the end, or musical nationalism. Well, if what you were trained to do was to study German music with the kinds of tools that enable you to get at that repertory, it's not surprising that other kinds of music didn't seem all that interesting, because it was not about counterpoint in the same way. It was not about certain kinds of harmonic progressions in the same way. It might be more about orchestral color. No theory about orchestral color. Might be about rhythm in an important way. The amount of music theory written about rhythm is minuscule compared with the amount of music theory written about notes, about pitch classes and fancy harmonies of the kind that Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, Brahms, Mahler all used in their music. So this is by way of saying that if you come at any subject, including philanthropy, with a predisposition to use certain kinds of approaches, you'll naturally run the risk of overlooking certain kinds of things. Sometimes I think that philanthropy has been, or some quarters of philanthropy have been, too much in the thrall of the social sciences generally. And it often comes down to a practice of feeding these mice a lot and feeding these mice not very much, and then seeing which ones get fat. This is the way sometimes we measure whether we're having impact or effectiveness. We construct some kind of social scientific experiment, and we want to keep a lot of data and so forth, and see who prospers and so forth. That may be a perfectly useful approach, but there will be a number of things worth engaging that don't lend themselves to that particular kind of activity. And indeed, thinking that way and taking that kind of approach to philanthropy can, I think, lead to significant mistakes. The other thing, of course, that afflicts us in this society is the culture of sports. We think that there has to be a top 10 of everything, and the world is divided into winners and losers. And if you can't prove you're a winner or can't prove that you're in the top 10, you somehow have been wasting your time, or you haven't amounted to very much. Higher education is, of course, deep in the thrall of this, and we would be better off if it weren't. Partly, here again, my perspective is that of higher education. You know, the really big news on every campus, every day, the big news, the kind of thing that John Burness would want to tell everybody, is that today several thousand young people had an idea that they had never had before. Alas, doesn't sell newspapers. So that never gets on the front page. What gets on the front page is a lot of other stuff where you can claim to be in the top 10. Sometimes it's choosing a subject at random, basketball. But sometimes it has a way of privileging science, because after all, in science there are new discoveries every day, and you can show that you're in the top 10 and this and that in some scientific fields. Indeed, if you go to the math department or the computer science department and you say, which are the best departments in the country, they will tell you with absolute certainty the top 10 departments are, and they'll name them in order, and they are convinced that that's really right. And maybe in mathematics you can talk that way, but in most things you simply can't. And as I say, the really important thing about what goes on in higher education is, in my view, something that is manifestly not quantifiable. And it's, if there is any sense in which you could conduct a scientific survey to find out whether this approach to education or that one is successful, you'd want to do it 10 years or 20 after the student graduated, by which time it's too late to change the curriculum for them, right? I mean, there is a reason one has to assume why some people are called the teachers and other people are called the students. And if you're not willing to suspend belief for some amount of time, if the so-called student is not prepared to suspend disbelief for some period and put him or herself in the hands of the teacher, then there's no fruitful pedagogical relationship likely to be born, and you'll only know the outcome of this probably a lot later. So my homely tale of this on the rubber chicken circuit has always been that if I ran the store across the street from the campus that sold the sweatshirts, it said Duke on the front or on the back or both, it would be my goal to have the student walk in, say, I want a sweatshirt. I hand the student a sweatshirt and they hold it up. This fits perfectly. They give me their money. They take my sweatshirt. The deal is done and the customer is satisfied. But in my business as a faculty member or as a university administrator, it's the kid comes into the store and I hand the kid a sweatshirt and the kid says, this is way too big. And I say, that's right. You do 100 push-ups a day for 4 years and it'll fit you perfectly. In the music business, it's in some ways a little bit easier. If you want to study the violin with Ivan Galamian, you do what Ivan Galamian says, and if you don't want to do what he says, you study with somebody else, and maybe you get good and maybe you don't. But in music, the key ingredient is not to have a teacher who can tell you where to put your fingers. It's a teacher who can get you to practice. And that's what I mean about the need to establish in any fruitful pedagogical relationship this element of trust, the willingness to do what you, on the basis of your experience, think I ought to do because you believe it'll be good for me, and I'm trusting you that it is going to be good for me, even if I can't be sure at every moment. Well, I think philanthropy has many things in common with this feature of higher education. I mean, for one thing, if your philanthropy concerns higher education, I would hope you'd want to take account of that fact about higher education. So in the support of higher education, it's, alas, all too familiar that some foundations will come along and say, I have a great idea for you. We'd like to see you do the following, which you're not now doing, and we'll give you the money for 2 years, and then you'll support it yourself. And in the meantime, you'll jump through many hoops and write many reports. And you may even write reports long after this grant is over, so we'll know if we were effective and had impact. There are times when such a thing might be appropriate, but I think at this particular moment in the financial catastrophe we're witnessing and all involved with in some way, it's important to bear in mind that one of the things philanthropy might reasonably be doing, especially in the world of higher education, is supporting institutions that have very long time horizons, whose missions, objectives don't change all that much over long periods of time, even though the practical implementation may change. New subjects will be born and be taught and so forth. But in the end, as I say around the Mellon Foundation, you know, we support only money-losing businesses. And that means all universities and all symphony orchestras and opera companies and all the things that we support are all money-losing businesses in their nature. And what does that imply for us? Well, it means we cannot responsibly insist that the only way we're going to give any of these institutions money is if they get into something that they're not already into and then pick up the tab themselves very quickly. It seems to me, especially today, that we have some responsibility to recognize the need of these institutions to buy their groceries. Somebody needs to be giving them money, not just the parents of undergraduates. Somebody needs to be giving them money simply to keep their doors open and to continue to do the kinds of things that we believe they do for the benefit of society. Now, another aspect of philanthropy that's much talked about, and if you've seen Paul Brest's recent book, you'll see a lot of this, especially in the opening pages. I have not yet got to the end of it.
I won't tell them.
Oh, I have a bookmark to prove that. The fact is, you know, if you ask me what I'm reading at any time, I'm reading hundreds of books, because I never give up on one. I very often don't finish them, but there's a bookmark there, and I'm coming back to it. I really am going to come back to that book someday. Well, I started Paul's book recently enough. I'm still in the phase of making progress. Anyway, he talks a lot about solving problems. That, you know, if you want to go into philanthropy, I mean, it's a kind of how-to in many respects. You want to have a foundation, this is how you ought to think about it. And it's mostly framed, although he recognizes other possibilities, but it's mostly framed in terms of identifying a problem that you would like to solve and then how you organize yourself to solve that problem. Well, there are many problems that cry for solution, and you will know how you have impact and effectiveness if what you do is go after one of those problems for which you believe there are reasonable tools. You, of course, need intelligent people to help you discover what those tools might be, and you may wish to support the development of more and better tools to solve that problem. But if you would like to reduce the incidence of malaria in Africa among children, and I mean, you know that a mosquito net costs $5, and every mosquito net can be counted on to reduce the incidence by X amount. Buy enough mosquito nets, you will have an impact, and it will be possible to measure this. And you can think of many other examples. But some of the most important things that one might want to support with philanthropic dollars simply don't lend themselves to that kind of, they are not a problem of the kind that is susceptible of a solution in anything like what we usually mean by solution. And so I come back to the kinds of things that might go on in higher education or in cultural institutions where the goal is to sustain some activity that we might believe is inherently worth doing. That you may, in fact, have no very good method of proving that this is good for people, but that nevertheless you support because you have an abiding belief that this is inherently worth doing, that it's good for people in some very deep sense to be doing it. Reading poems might be one of those things. Reading Thucydides might be one of those things. You could wish that more people in the current administration had read Pericles' funeral oration, you know, and reading that every year, year in, year out, is a perfectly good thing to do. Doesn't sell newspapers. You can't claim you solved the problem because you're helping to pay for that. Nevertheless, the value of it, I think, is something that thoughtful people will agree to. The problem about going after problems is not only that it forecloses or may blind one to kinds of things that are not easily formulated as problems, but it's also that it's very easy to make a mistake. What you think of as the problem may turn out not to have been a problem, and the solution you propose to apply may turn out not to solve it in any case. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, with two very smart people working on it, Bill Bowen and Neil Rudenstein, Bill's an economist, as you know, led a very detailed, serious study of the need for PhDs in the humanities to fill the ranks of the professoriate because a huge change was going to take place. There was going to be a huge demand for new faculty members. This had been demonstrated in the study, and therefore the Mellon Foundation should try to ramp up the production of PhDs in the humanities. That would be partly by reducing the time to degree, which everybody had lamented more or less since the Middle Ages. And so the effort was launched. Well, in point of fact, those jobs didn't show up. And many things were tried at different institutions. Institutions were allowed, I think, very thoughtfully to define their own particular needs. But the time to degree didn't really go down all that much. And there were many theories about that. Part of it, one of them was that, well, since it turned out there weren't any jobs, nobody was in a hurry to get out, and so there were all kinds of good reasons to prolong your stay in graduate school. But this, I take it, I mentioned simply as an example of how very smart people using the best tools imaginable simply identified a problem that turned out not to exist and proposed solutions to it that turned out not to make much difference of the kind that they had hoped to make. I suppose this is all by way of saying that modesty is called for in all human activities, including philanthropy. And that's what I mean by saying that one needs to be a good listener for other people's good ideas as well. If you think about some of the kinds of things in higher education that you might be tempted to support, some of them are really extraordinarily big. And you may identify the problem, but you may have some dismay at ever being able to affect an outcome over a very broad scale. So let's take the case of the ability of young people to write. We would all agree this is extremely important. One of the main things you ought to get in your education is some ability to write and think with discipline. These things go together. You don't write effectively if you don't think effectively, and you don't think effectively if you're unable to write effectively. So how are we going to go about this? Well, you know, in the end, there is no standardized test that gets you to do this. The only way you learn to write is by writing and having somebody who sits down with you and reads it and challenges you to think about it. Doesn't just tell you where the commas and the semicolons go, but helps you refine your thinking, make this argument stronger, make better use of the data or whatever material the paper is about. Well, here, if there ever was a field in which it's hard to make productivity gains, this is one. And this is going to be a huge part of why universities and colleges are going to be money-losing businesses, and it will take philanthropy always to try to close the gap between the rate at which their costs increase and the rate at which they can possibly hope to raise their prices. I taught in the freshman writing program at Cornell for a number of years. Hardest work known to man. But think of it this way. Even sort of early in the semester, you assign papers. We had seminars, maximum of 17 students. We would wring our hands about how many students you could reasonably have. Programs started out with 15, then money reared its ugly head, so we let it creep up to 17. But, okay, 17 students in my class, I assigned 2 or 3 pages to write. And there was a requirement. You had to have some written work every week and something signet every other week. Well, I could never thoughtfully comment, because this is a crucial part of it, that is, to write comments on a paper. I couldn't get through that in much less than 30 minutes apiece. 30 minutes apiece for 17 students, that's a whole day's work right there, or the 8-hour part of the day. Well, writing the comments on those papers really doesn't do much good. I mean, we're assuming here that what you can't do is say, good, B, right? You need to have thoughtful comments. And the students will often look to the bottom and see B and not read the comments. So the only way this works is if you have a conference with everyone and you have to sit there and engage them in a conversation about this and go over what might make it better, suggestions for revision. Well, you can't meet every student in the class. That's probably 30 minutes apiece. You can't do it any faster than that. That's another 8.5-hour day you've consigned. And I've only got 17 students. I've spent 2 days doing this one thing, and I haven't yet prepared the class. I've got to be on a whole bunch of committees. I teach Introduction to Music to 175 kids on Monday and Wednesday mornings. I got to manage my TAs and so on and so on. You wonder why Johnny can't write when the typical high school student, high school teacher of English, probably has 5 or 6 sections of 30 students. I mean, this poor person has got 150 students, and she assigns, or he assigns, 1 page, and they're swamped. And so a kind of triage takes place. You just hope you're going to identify the good ones and rescue the people at the bottom. And you do it by teaching them formulas, the 5-paragraph essay, which then when they get to college, if they have getting a good writing program, you have to break them of those formulas. This is all by way of saying that some of the things that matter most about what you would think higher education is going to do for young people will be things that take time and energy of thoughtful individuals, that it will not be easy to measure, although I would be glad to swear that a program like the one we had at Cornell is much better than lots of others where they don't have anything like that intense kind of experience. But what is the nature of the impact of this? I would say, as I said many times as a Dean of Arts and Sciences at Cornell, to a donor, whether a foundation, and indeed I'm sorry Harding Carter left because the Knight Foundation was one of the main supporters of that program. That program did more good than anything else I can think of. I've had to pick one thing, and if I were to talk to a donor, I'd say that's one of the best things you can do for us, is to support that program. But is it doing something new that I wasn't doing a year ago? No. Is it producing some novel product or cure for some disease that we didn't already know about? No. But profoundly and deeply worth doing. And to some degree, the philanthropist, I think, needs to have room, or enough philanthropists need to have room in their souls for doing things like that, which won't make good newspaper copy, but that will be deeply important to the lives of individuals. In this respect, I think it's worth thinking about philanthropy in general with the nature of giving to your church or synagogue. Partly, you do it just to sustain the activity. When the collection plate comes around, you don't say, I want my $5 to go for this or that. You support the institution broadly because you think it's inherently important and worth supporting. And if you come from a slightly evangelical tradition, you may say, you know, we're interested in saving lives one at a time. Well, every life is worth saving. Every freshman is worth being taught how to write. And you hope it adds up to a lot, but you have done good work in your life if you have done 17 a year for some number of years, and not all 17 turned out to be good. Once again, this is by way of saying that certain activities we pursue because of a kind of deep importance and our commitment to it that simply doesn't yield to the typical ways of talking about impact and effectiveness, and certainly not novelties. The question then is, how will you know? Part of what one needs is the courage not to insist on knowing. That part of what one does is a function of belief and commitment rather than a function of an insistence on something that one could describe as impact and effectiveness. You may not know, in fact. One doesn't know how it is that poems have in them something that might prevent people from dying miserably every day, because the way in which they die miserably for want of poetry is itself not something so easy to measure or diagnose. Philanthropy, like the pedagogical relationship that turns out to be truly fruitful, requires trust, a kind of willing suspension of disbelief. You have to identify people that you think, or organizations you think you can trust, and then let them do their work without looking over their shoulder too very much, I think, often. I think a good recipe in philanthropy is to keep it simple. And then I think finally that with all the talk about being an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist and many analogies that are made, I think in the end we're much more like bookies. You have to know something about statistics, but you go to the track and you say, that's a good looking one. $2 on his nose. And then stand back and watch the magic happen. Thank you. Let me stop there and let's have your declarations of outrage and your penetrating questions.
Or your $2. Thank you, and let's go for some questions. Yes, Sonny?
I'm going to comment. I should be asking for tough numbers, but I found everything you said refreshing. So I like it. But it is the case that foundations are able to do anything because of tax breaks.
Mm-hmm.
There is some public funding involved. And so I would be interested to know how you think about the responsibility to the public taxpayer.
Mm-hmm. This is a subject about which I can get exercised. Get Grassley on the phone and we'll have it out. For for a start, absolutely no doubt that the philanthropy of foundations and of individuals is the beneficiary of the tax code. And there the problem, I think, in our society, I mentioned Grassley because he's been much on my mind lately. Part of the problem there is that in this country we have, and you see it in the newspaper every day in the last few weeks, we have a deep ambivalence to the question of income redistribution. And do you want income redistribution to be done by the tax code, and much of what's done with the resources, therefore, in the hands of state, local, federal government, or do you want to leave that to private entities? So one of the things Senator Grassley has been advocating making a mandatory spend rate for university endowments. And also saying that these rich institutions could lower tuition and give more money to poor people. Well, every private institution of higher education, and the public ones too, everyone is engaged in redistributing income, charging one thing, collecting from people who can maybe afford to pay, and giving it back in some form to people who can't. The question is that's the right level at which to be doing income redistribution? I mean, that's what Senator Grassley really wants, but he's ready to leave it to the private sphere and a few thousand institutions to do it in some more or less incoherent way. To that, I would have to add that the truth of the matter is there are only 4 truly rich universities in this country, and then there are all the rest. So a multi-billion-dollar endowment, $5 or $6 or $7 billion, which is in the range of Duke, Columbia, Penn, Cornell, Chicago. All of those institutions are also recycling tuition dollars and redistributing income by that method. This is the system we have. If the government wanted to tax it away higher upstream and influence policy by that method, I think that would be preferable to hassling colleges and universities and foundations and other charities to do this as opposed to that. I mean, if Senator Grassley and Senator Baucus thinks that foundations or people with wealth should spend more money in rural areas than they're now doing, the way to do that is to get some legislation passed that says we're going to have programs for rural people, and not to let people set up charities and then heckle them to do some particular thing that they want to do. We have a responsibility to the public because it is public money in many respects, but within that, I think you have to decide how much freedom you're going to let people have with their philanthropic dollars, and then let them have it, and don't complain that they're not doing what you wanted them to do, I think.
You can also, and it seems to me, that who's to say that teaching kids how to write is not in the public interest? I mean, and there are many, many different ways of discharging those responsibilities to the public interest. And almost anything that a university does, or that whether public or private, can be regarded as being responsive, because it all involves these value judgments about what's important, what isn't important. So it seems to me that there's no one way. And Don picked up on the redistributional aspect of it, and all of these institutions are doing that to a large extent anyway. But it's hard to me to make a case that the obligation to the public requires a certain kind of response on the part of institutions, because the very nature of an educational institution is, as he described it, it really depends on the values and the choices in fulfilling those values that each institution makes themselves. So But I take your point. I mean, I believe that there is an obligation to spend foundation money in response to what the public interest is. But you know, who's to say that Ruth Lilly was wrong in giving $100 million to the American Poetry Foundation Association, which is, you know, unheard of size gift to that kind of thing. I believe that's in the public interest too, for the same reasons that Don did.
I mean, another piece of this on the subject of higher education and its entanglements with the federal government that bears on, I think, this question is the private subsidy for basic research that's done in the national interest. So scientific research, the subsidy to scientific research nominally sponsored by the federal government, the subsidy from the private sector and from philanthropy is enormous, and nobody likes to talk about that very much. I mean, the capital costs of that are not paid by the federal government at all. If you look at faculty teaching loads across disciplines, you know, if the physicist had as many students as the English professor, I could have half as many physicists, and whole set of things there. Means by which federal policy is executed thanks to private philanthropy and to the parents of undergraduates. So to say, you shouldn't be raising tuition, but oh, by the way, we want more cost sharing from you on your government contracts, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we're going to reduce your overhead rate. There's a lot of wanting to have it all ways at once, I think, coming from sectors of government, which would be very nice if one could straighten that out, although I'm not optimistic. Yes, sir.
In a socialist country, public policy set by the government, and there really isn't room for private philanthropy. We're not a socialist country. We say you have to, we're going to, in effect, deregulate or let the market work in terms of selecting problems and working on them. So foundations are obligated to spend a percentage of their income. Why is it wrong then for universities not to have faith a similar requirement? It's not saying we're going to tell you what you've got to do and it has to conform to public policy. We're simply saying you can't sit around accumulating a lot of money
right.
and not exercising this obligation to which we're giving you this freedom and these tax breaks.
Right. The problem with a fixed spending rate for endowments is that it eliminates your ability to have a smoothing function so that when markets go down as they are now, you'll be able to keep the dollar amount of your spending rising slowly. So most universities have a kind of a formula in which you average income from investments over time, and when the market is booming, you may be spending only, sometimes it got down to as low as 3%, but when the market is taking a crash, you'll be able to afford to spend 6 or 7%. Foundations are precluded from doing that to anything like the same degree, and so the result is, right now, many foundations, because in the good times, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, they were obliged to continue to pay out the 5%, were not essentially permitted to stick some in the piggy bank in those really good years. Now many of them are having to reduce their budgets. So the grant making of the Mellon Foundation this year will be, we cut our budget by about 10% in year. Otherwise, one would see one's assets decline. I mean, if you think about it this way, I agree with you, neither universities nor foundations should hoard money. There's no point in allowing them to get richer and richer for the sake of being richer unless it has a payoff for the public good. But let's say what you'd like to do, you got a pile of money from Mr. Mellon, and you would like to preserve the real value of that money over time, which is to say you would like to preserve the real value of your grant-making budget. Inflation over the, 40-some years since Mr. Mellon gave us that money has run maybe 4%, a little bit on average. So let's say what you'd like to be able to do in order to preserve the real value of that, you need to have your spending amount every year go up by, let's call it 5%. So in order for that to happen, since you don't have any new money coming in, you've got to make 10% on your money, because you're going to give away 5%, but you need the endowment to grow by 5% so as to preserve the real value of it. Well, 5% as an average over time you might be able to hit, although people now doubt that this is, and many universities use 8 to 10, some have tried to tweak it up to 12 in the past 5 years, but they're going to start untweaking very quickly now. You've got to be able to make on average at least 10% on your money if you're going to keep your grant-making budget inflation-proof over time. And you need to be able to let that spending amount vary so that you can, as I say, sock it away in good times so that you don't have to reduce your spending when the market takes a dive. I think it would be better if foundations were, if a more sensible set of principles were developed for foundations that would permit them to do more like universities, because you know what, the university, if a big part of your financial aid budget comes from the endowment and you have a fixed spending rule and your endowment goes down, then you have fewer scholarships from one year to the next as a function of the markets. I think that's not in anybody's interest.
Don, before you ask it, I came from the foundation, and we did a 3-year rolling average for our endowment payouts. You're making it sound like that's not done, and I had colleagues that did the same.
Yes, everybody is doing something like that. You do have the obligation to hit the 5%, however, and in this last year, of course, we've seen such a huge swing. It's not easy to see how you will average that over 3 years. And the other thing about the federal tax code for foundations is that if you don't spend on a certain track, it costs you an extra % of excise tax. So you can find yourself, I mean, we gave a couple of years ago before I came, gave the federal government $5 or $6 million that we could have given to grantees.
I was wondering if you could share with us some perspectives you've had on the ways in which foundations can help institutions such as ours who are thinking about educating people for public service. And by way of framing that, some years ago, Paul Volcker talked about a crisis in public service. People either prepared or inclined to go into public service. And part of that was the context of the time. Part of it was politics, people not being able to afford and needing financial aid because they couldn't aspire to raise a lot of money. And yet, in spite of all that, our students, for example, all are lining up the undergraduates to teach for America for a couple of years. And so there's a lot of idealism there. And, I think we've thought of a number of different ways of thinking about that. The university has talked about knowledge in the service of society, bridging the two worlds, academia and the so-called real world, assuming, I guess, ours isn't. And they've got this thing called Youth Engage that gets our students right involved with all kinds of activities as a way of getting going. Some people have negatively characterized that as moral tourism, that doesn't really get them on top of it. And the idea is we need to do a better job of following up. As an institution, we have internships where we try to pair them with the analytical toolbox, even though we recognize it's got its limitations, and we think things like history and ethics are important. But that's another way, and I know that the Ford Foundation has talked about, in their international affairs fellowships that they did with the Council on Foreign Relations, getting faculty out into government and then back so that they'd be better kinds of mentors, which we also do with professors of the practice. So we sort of have all these different ways of trying to somehow bridge the gap there. And fundamental to our undergraduate education is the importance of a liberal arts education. So, I would resonate totally with you there. And the question is, in your years, both at Cornell but also at the foundation, have you found anything that works better than anything else, or is it all of the above, or how do you think about it?
Well, I suppose my my principal perspective on that really is formed at Chicago, where one had a very good example in the School of Social Service Administration and in the Harris School of Public Policy there, and this situation in which you're trying to train people who are going into to go into public service in some way, and they don't become wealthy, and it turns out you don't have a big donor base. And so one of the big problems there was how to bring about the internal subsidy to this activity that it would require in some way. And the business school dean doesn't want to hear that you're supporting the public policy school, thanks to him in any way. So partly universities, if they're really serious about this, do need to say, well, the fact that the graduates of the School of Social Service Administration, the fact that they don't go on to make a lot of money and have a lot of money to give, shouldn't mean that they live in a slum while the business school lives in a palace, and that we are not going to do something about trying to find the resources. Point number one. The other thing is, I think in such schools, and I would say this about business and law as well, and here's where Chicago will come out, it really has to all rest on the highest quality of academic pursuit. Underneath it all, there has to be very serious research capability there. Universities are much too hung up in practically every field, I think, over the difference between pure and applied, or basic and applied. That's a distinction which tends to disappear the more you scratch at it. And there's some very great economists with Nobel laureates at Chicago who actually study real problems of real people. And one should be much more open to that than a lot of the social sciences have been, but there are plenty of other fields that suffer from the same thing. It goes back to the 19th century German university, where the 19th. I have people giggle when I start to rant about the 19th century German university, but it's this legacy of where thinking and doing were two different activities, and so the people who studied music or studied art did it in one place, and the people who made those things did it in someplace else, and you see it all over this country. And the private institutions have historically been the worst about making sure that it's strictly academic and has no applied dimension. In a school of public policy, you really have to get over that. But you shouldn't get over it by ceding the ground entirely to of the sort of basic research side to some other department somewhere. So getting the other social science departments, as well as some of the humanities departments, engaged in the enterprise, I think is crucial. It will not amount to what you want it to amount to if it's confined to this building somehow. And the techniques you try may vary over time. Joel got me involved in an organization that's trying to encourage young people to go into public service, because there is a huge crisis upon us about this. Youthful enthusiasm for this waxes and wanes, and we've been through, up until maybe just very recently, a kind of trough on that, I would say, and you can understand why young people might be cynical. It is my fervent hope that we might, in a new administration, see young people enthusiastic about going to Washington again and doing lots of other things of that kind. Teach for America is an interesting case. Has attracted a lot of young people committed to this, but it's also a cautionary tale in a number of respects, because it hasn't been universally successful. And so here, effectiveness really does need to be measured, and can be in some degree. A lot of those young people need more support in the activity than they have been getting. And you can come and you spend especially in difficult urban schools. You come and spend the summer and you learn how to make lesson plans, and of course you were a history major, so you actually know something about history, which is more than many can say. And you go into this 5th grade classroom ready to start teaching history, and nobody ever told you anything about how you get these kids to sit down. And then, you know, a lot of them, these young teachers go into public schools, there's no support network. The biggest single problem is, or a bigger problem than getting them to go into teaching, is to keep them in teaching. So 2 years and they flame out. One of the things we did at Chicago was to develop a network all over the city to work with new teachers and keep them in touch with one another and with more experienced teachers to help them. And by golly, we had impact. It was effective. We could measure how long these teachers were staying in the profession, and we managed to lengthen it by some number of years. So youthful enthusiasm is powerfully important, but one needs to provide the right kind of support for it as well. No simple answer to your question. It was a big, long question.
Well, you know, I just simply footnote, what you prescribe in terms of reaching out from public policy throughout the university is something that we've been doing really from the very beginning. We had humanities requirements, ethics requirements, anthropology requirements as part of the faculty members from those disciplines in our faculty here from the very beginning, historians, others, because it really is important to bring those in. If you want to have a true liberal arts education for students going into public service, you've got to do that. And it seems to me, and that of course tradition has continued here. We have I don't know whether Tricia wants to say. Tricia Bailey is a graduate of Duke who was in Teach for America and who had something like the same experience as you just described in teaching.
My children sat down though. Absolutely. But yes, I didn't stay on for a second year. And it's exactly because of what you're talking about in terms of the organization. You know, I was given more work by the organization than support. And so my situation was unique, but what you said definitely speaks to me. And as an aspiring public servant, I got very disenchanted very quickly.
Yeah.
There.
Oh, hi. Well, I had a question, but just to piggyback off the Teach for America thing, I have two friends from FSU who are doing it. One actually had an education, a higher education degree. That was what she majored in, and the other she majored in American politics and history. So it was it was really interesting to hear both of them talk about it, because my friend Kelly said, I don't know how. She said, I'm having the hardest time doing it because there's no support. She said, I don't know what teachers who don't have experience with behavioral, techniques, and students who aren't going to listen, what they're going to do. And I talked to my other friend, and I said, well, how's it going? She says, well, it's good. And I'm at Penn, and I was like, asked her again, what? And she said, well, if you do Teach for America, they pay for your grad school, so I'm going to UPenn. I was like, well, that's great, but it was kind of like, she missed the ball by like a mile. But as far as what she was there for, she was, she got her master's and she finishes this year and she's going to law school. So it was really interesting to kind of see the people who are doing it because they cared about education, and I think that it's interesting. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's great for some people, but not for others. But my question is actually really related. But my experience before I came to the master's program was working in fundraising for private donors for the United Nations World Food Program. And we had some of the same troubles that you were describing. And while I was there, one of the basically thresholds that they put in for due diligence for any kind of donation was any donation under $1 million couldn't be, I guess, targeted. You couldn't say what you were going to put it into. And we would get people all the time that wanted to donate, $100 or $200 and wanted it to go to the Project X. But there was that fostering of, the organization and the faith in the organization. So I don't really know if foundations do that. Has that been employed to try to have it be more about the foundation and about the projects?
Well, foundations vary considerably in that respect, and many are project-driven, and they only want to make grants in support of specific projects with certain outcomes. And as I say, in some cases, it's it won't be to support an ongoing program. Every program has to be a new program. And the pursuit of novelty, I think, can be pernicious in that regard. The Mellon Foundation is not allergic to making endowment grants for ongoing programs, and sometimes we will make a series of spendable grants for this and that, and then we'll endow it at the end. One of the main things, we have created postdoctoral fellowships in the humanities all over the country, and simple as that. There aren't postdocs in the humanities the way there are in scientific fields and so forth. But let the university decide what fields it wants to have them in the humanities, and this can be very good for the young people, we believe. Gives them an opportunity to do something beyond their scholarship, to get things going before they're swamped in a full-time teaching job. Gives them a chance to start to teach before they have a full-time teaching load, usually, and enables colleges and universities to bring in new, young, smart talent without increasing the size of their permanent faculty, all kinds of things. But we're quite flexible about how they do it. In the last few years, we've made some substantial grants to endow graduate fellowships in the humanities, and letting the universities decide what their field are. So we're on sort of one end of that spectrum. We do a lot more of that kind of helping them buy their groceries, keeping them in business to do things that we value. Graduate fellowship support in the humanities, of course, has been in very short supply, and lots of graduate students in the humanities. Even some universities hate to think about it, but a graduate student in English doesn't get health insurance, and if you're in biology or chemistry, you do get health insurance. I think that seems to me contrary to the principles that universities ought to live by. So, we've tried to help universities, and relatively limited number to be sure that we work with, to rectify that imbalance. So part of what we're up to often is trying to put a thumb on the scale in behalf of something that society, the government, you name it, has not taken such an interest in.
How do you account for, John, let me just, it follows on this question and answer to it. The Mellon Foundation is one of the very few foundations in the country that does what Don has just been describing, in terms of you look in vain to see other foundations that are supporting the humanities in general. Very few foundations support the humanities. Virtually no foundations would say what he has just said about making endowment grants. Typically, they do not do it. The first thing they rule out if you try to get an endowment grant is, I'm sorry, we don't do endowment grant. That's 99% of the foundation universe. So the question that I've always wondered with, and I tried to grapple with it a little bit in the book, is how do you account for the difference in culture between the Mellon Foundation and other foundations? Why is it that you all are so enthusiastic about this, and why is it that everybody else is not? And I just think what you're doing is so important, and I just puzzled by everybody else's negative reaction to it.
Yeah. Has a lot to do with Paul Mellon, I think, who was a deep believer in the humanities and the arts, because we do similar things in arts organizations. It's a terrible thing to say about the country, but the Mellon Foundation's giving is bigger than the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities combined.
In any given year.
In any given year. It's a terrible thing to say about the country, but we have this field to ourselves in a very considerable degree.
Feels lonely, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so I think we have to stick to it. In fact, if you were to, compare me with Bill, I have moved it back in that direction. So I mean, Bill had some major technology project. Bill Bowen, my predecessor, started JSTOR, which is certainly one of the great things ever. An art store, which is not quite self-supporting yet, turns out to be a somewhat harder problem than was first imagined. But a couple of big projects like that, and he,
Whatever that is.
it's in a state of evolution. So in fact, he diverted funds from humanities and the arts to do some of those projects, and I have put it all back into this core humanities support. And I don't mind saying I can't think of another foundation that I would have been willing to go to work for, precisely because it's about things that have mattered to my academic life, and in these fields, in humanistic scholarship and teaching, you don't need somebody to come tell you to do some novel thing. I mean, it's in the nature of the case to do it in new ways and fresh ways, to be sure, but this is something that by its nature has this kind of inherent value that doesn't change quickly over time. It would be terrible if it did. And doesn't lend itself to technology solutions. I mean, you won't teach a kid to write effectively by distance learning with somebody who never can sit down with an individual and say, think about this. What were you really trying? What were you thinking when you wrote this? As opposed to kids who start writing without knowing how the sentence is going to end.
I take it from what you also said that you would not be in favor of having at the Mellon Foundation decide that teaching writing is the most important thing that that colleges and universities should do, and that we're going to make a series of grants to support the teaching of writing.
We have not undertaken to support the teaching of writing, but in our work with undergraduate colleges, it's rethinking your curriculum and letting colleges come to us and say, we think in pursuit of our goal of liberal education, we really need to get faculty involved in doing this, that, or the other thing, and let them give us the idea for how to support it. And if it were to help us strengthen our writing program, we'd certainly want to listen to that.
Something you said at the beginning got me thinking, which is you talked about how universities really think in the long haul. Some folks tend to fund organizations that think in long haul about the issues they have. One of the things that I have come to understand a little bit more due to some work that's been done by you with the community is in order to make a difference in low-level communities, organizations like a big entity like this, you have to overcome so many levels of trust or mystery that the normal 3 to 4 year cycle of foundations simply, in my experience, doesn't work when you get a grant. That if you're really trying to have an impact with low-level communities, because it can take you 5 to 6 to 7 years just to establish the basis of trust. Lets you move on and lets the community build up its own sense of capability of what it can do, and once that happens, it really thrives. And we've seen some of that actually happen here. Is there any likelihood in your judgment that the foundation world would move off the sort of short-term cycle of expectation, where then the organization quote takes it over? Is that remotely realistic?
I mean, it is certainly not the habit of the foundation world in general. And I mean, it's something that I have to admit, I come to this work having had most of my life a rather low opinion of the foundation world, precisely for that it's the most fickle money imaginable. It's here today and gone tomorrow and leaves you holding the bag. Now,
It doesn't stop us from going for it all the time.
no, right. And of course, part of the faculty is really smart. They'll go where the money is, and if they can get money to do this or that, they will often pursue it, even though it's not in the interest of the institution, really, or not in their long-term interest. I mean, this is a national problem. We have a very short attention span nationally. It's a problem in the world of business. It's a problem in the national investment in its intellectual infrastructure, its scientific infrastructure, its physical infrastructure. How we get more people in this country to be willing to deal with big problems over a long term, I don't know. And the enemy is us. You think of businesses that have gone headlong after quarterly returns. By golly, if you can't demonstrate quarterly growth, take you out and shoot you. And whose money's driving that? CalPERS and TIA Cref. I mean, it's our money. We want to retire on a lot of money, and so we are indirectly fostering this sort of short horizon view. And where the national will is going to come from, whether it's foundations or government or the private sector, to take a slightly longer range view of very many things that are only going to be helped by a long-term view. I'm not sure where that comes from. But I agree with you about community relations. It's absolutely crucial, and universities need to do more about that. Depends a lot on their circumstances. It can't be just that you build a nice ring of retail around your campus so that your students and their parents will feel better. You've got to leave something behind in this community. And that takes establishing trust. You've got to go out there and get to know people and show up at their churches and a whole range of things that it takes to establish a kind of trust. Chicago had a terrible history in that regard, and I put a lot of energy into it, and in 6 years made a difference. But it requires attention. It will go off the rails immediately if you don't continue to attend.
And if there's not leadership at
That is one place where the tone at the top can make a huge difference. And similarly with some other things, diversity. There's some other things like that. I mean, even strategic planning. I'm slightly allergic to strategic planning as an activity, but if you're going to have it, by golly, there better be commitment at the top, and everybody better see that there's alignment all up and down, because it won't happen if the president is seen not to be really participating this in a daily way.
Leslie, did you have a question?
I did. We do give a lot of general operating support, about half of our grants.
Mm-hmm.
And we give money to some people forever. There are people we've funded for 20 years.
Good for you.
But I'm very new to philanthropy. I just came to this in January. I never had anything to do with philanthropy before that. And have really been wrestling with this question of how much you need to learn and how much resources you invest in learning about the effectiveness of your grant making and being sure that you're spending your money well. So you spent most of your speech talking about this idea of having trusting your instincts about your values and the organizations you're investing in. And then as a kind of toss away, you said, but you shouldn't fund Teach for America if you don't know they're being effective. So we do some things that are really hard to measure, like invest in improving race relations. And we do some things that are easier to measure, like trying to increase the supply of affordable housing. But I was just wondering if you kind of have a way you think about what kinds of things you really need to measure and what kinds of things it's okay just to kind of go on faith.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have said don't support Teach for America. I only meant to say could be better.
Well, you didn't say, no, you just said you need to be sure that they're being effective when you're deciding whether to
right.
fund them.
If you're trying to solve a problem that you can measure, where you can measure effectiveness, then you ought to measure it and discover whether it's being effective. I mean, I congratulate you, and I think North Carolina I mean, the great North Carolina foundations have done great things for the state of North Carolina. I don't think you could name another state in the Union where the great families of the state have invested in the welfare, the well-being, broadly conceived, of the state to anything like the same degree. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. The educational institutions, cultural institutions, and so forth. And, you know, that only happens with long-term investments and a belief in the importance of certain kinds of activities. I think in the end, it really is all about values. I mean, business schools now have courses about values and ethics and so forth. I often think if you have to wait for this MBA student to take a course that has ethics in the title, it's already too late. You know, if ethics isn't baked into the accounting course, but you make them learn accounting and then you teach them about ethics, not a good idea. I mean, you have to live certain kinds of values on a daily basis in everything that you do. And what that means, I think, is in the end, you have to be prepared to take risks. And the big risk that you take is somebody you trusted turned out not to be trustworthy or wasn't as good as you thought him to be, and so you spent some money on something and it's not clear that, I mean, you didn't feel good about it.
The bigger risk is that you invest in something that you can't measure, and at the end, you can't say to anybody whether they should try to replicate it or not. Because you don't know whether it actually did anything.
There are some domains in which that's the right question, but there are a lot of things worth supporting where those are not the right questions, where those questions can't be posed or answered.
So how do you tell which is in which camp? That's my question to you. I believe you.
Not so easy. I wouldn't insist that it's easy to do this. But if I think of our own activity at the Mellon Foundation, we are interested in higher education, performing arts organizations, libraries, because they support the activity of the humanities and higher education. And that's basically it.
All of those are hard to measure.
And in all of those domains, it's hard to measure. And I believe it's a wonderful thing for people to get to hear Beethoven symphonies. It's getting to be more and more expensive, and the audience is getting gray and young. I mean, you know what all the problems are. And yet, by golly, we ought to continue to support that. And I don't know if symphonies are going to survive, but they will as long as we can help them do it. Some of them are smarter than others, and some you might think, I don't think I want to.
You know from your success.
Pardon?
You think you know from your success. Yeah.
Well, as long as they keep giving good concerts, I'm successful. Yep.
But it's the same
All right,
thing
we're
with,
gonna-
yeah.
No,
I was
Joe,
just
go
going to
ahead.
add a footnote to Leslie's question. The fact that Reynolds has maintained long-run relationships with organizations builds that trust and gives you a chance to, the leaders. I mean, I think about the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research, which Reynolds was a key founder at the beginning of. You have worked closely with Rand Coble over 30 years, 35 years, so that you have a chance to build the relationship and watch and see how people perform. So that, in a sense, that substitutes, and you ask the question, how effective has it been? Most people would say it's been pretty effective in adding a layer of accountability to state government in North Carolina that it never had before and wouldn't have had except for that. So, build it, they go together in a sense. Sticking with an organization for a long time, watching them, getting to know them, knowing their trustees, knowing the people that run them, really does fit. It's an alternative way of making an assessment about impact because you know the organization just intimately.
Yeah, well, even with them, you can measure output.
You
It's
can,
hard-
sure,
it's
it's hard. Yeah,
It's
you
harder
can.
to measure actual impact.
Sure.
I'll do two more, and Eddie will do one, and I want to wrap it up.
Your point about the importance of values is well taken. Are you aware of any
are evolving? Evolving. Well, as I said, I guess I think of myself as sort of turning it back in the direction of some of its traditional concerns. We are continuing to support technology projects, but more, not on the scale of something like JSTOR, and also technology projects that do directly support humanistic scholarship and activities of the arts. So there are lots of technology needs in higher education. PeopleSoft has been a disaster for many universities, but I don't think I'm going to fix that problem because the university is going to have to fix it one way or another. You could say that if I help them with their HR financial system, the English department will benefit in some way, but not closely enough that I think it's going to be satisfying. So I'm not so interested in those big technology projects for higher education if they don't really bear on humanistic scholarship and teaching. So in that sense, I'm my own values, and I think the values of some of our trustees and our staff, my colleagues, are evolving in the direction of keeping it simple and getting back to some underlying principles that were always thought to be what we really stood for. And that, I think, is it's and you could say it's a kind of marketing principle almost, or a business principle. Figure out what's your core business and stick to it. Universities make this mistake all the time. Not if you think a lot of universities, if you run a successful business, part of your need is to differentiate yourself. And if you have a place on the horizon of higher education, you want to keep it, you don't want to dilute it. So I always said at Chicago, kid who doesn't know the difference between Brown and Chicago shouldn't come to Chicago, and we shouldn't feel bad about that. We don't need the applications of kids who would really be better off if they went to Brown. So, stick to what you believe in and don't apologize for it. I want to call on somebody in the audience. Professor Klotfelder has sat there with his brow wrinkled all afternoon, and as a student of some of his work, met you at Cornell and through Ron Ehrenberg and so forth. I want to know what his question is and his comment.
I was feeling pretty bad because of being an economist, so I felt like it was before the confession in the service. So
some of my best friends are economists,
But, I really am torn on a lot of the issues that you raised very appropriately, because I do believe that some of the most important outputs can't be measured, and I've been struggling with that, as some of my students know. We write the things on the board, but I also say it's not always that easy to apply. In the case of one study that I did with the Mellon support was we looked at the University of Chicago. We did measure things. We had Duke, Harvard, Chicago. We were looking at things you alluded to. The course loads in the sciences were much lower than they were in the humanities, and they were changing over time. So, I guess I'm sort of building on my next layer of humility.
I will say one thing in Charlie's defense, being a historian, and I know he studied history as an undergraduate, he's been a big fan of pushing history as part of our curriculum. And so even though he is an economist, he's
a good economist.
I kid you not, some of my best friends are economists, and you don't need to apologize to me for a minute, because I think you're one of the most thoughtful people writing in this world. I mean, I wish there were a couple more of you, or several more of you, writing about the economics of higher education sensibly, because, I mean, in the public sphere, so much nonsense is said about it. We need you as the antidote to that.
That's very
Yes.
I want to phrase this question carefully so as not to seem like it's rude. But there's a part of me that wonders if the support of institutions like symphonies and elite arts organizations is a little contrary to the purpose of a philanthropic foundation. I understand perhaps where the support of institutions of higher learning, there can be a line drawn from that work to effects in the real world through science and other activities that actually improve the day-to-day situations of people in the real world. But as much as an English major, I might agree that people die for lack of poetry. I actually don't really believe that. I think people die for lack of food and water and other things. And so I wonder if how you would respond to the idea that the support of certain arts organizations is really, it benefits the people who are already the elite of our society and not so much people who are truly in need.
You shouldn't apologize about that because I invited declarations of outrage and I'm surprised I didn't get more.
I'm outraged.
Good for you. One formulation of what you have said that I have seen in the public press is when X Foundation gives money to Y Symphony, it's rich people giving money to rich people at the taxpayer's expense.
That's what I'm getting at.
I concede that it is a scandal that the richest country the world has ever known should have so many poor people. I mean, and one of the remarkable things about this campaign has been remarked on. Nobody talks about poor people. We only talk about the middle class, by which we mean people who make up to $250,000. Median family income is $50,000, and 25% above that and 25% below it gets you to something like 30 to 68 or something. I mean, it's so how can we do anything with our money as long as there's so much misery, sickness, and that's just within our own borders, never mind other places where we could reasonably be thought to have some responsibility. I mean, how can you sit in a palace like this when you think of how many low-cost houses could be built for this, and we could have this school in Quonset huts and trailers, and it would, you know, if the faculty was any good, you wouldn't need this fancy stuff. You'd learn. I mean, if you want to know what to do for Duke University, order me how many students you got, how many faculty, order me that many logs, and I'll put faculty member on one end. And then, so you know, the fact is one does have to make some decisions about what's worth doing. We will not succeed in leveling it. Even radical socialist regimes didn't succeed in that. So we have to make some decisions. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the value of culture, broadly speaking, and of the arts in general? And if what you think is that the arts are, in fact, the mere entertainment of the well-to-do when the real work of the day is over, then you'd be bound not to want to support them much, and that's mostly what people in this country believe, which is why we don't support them much, really. But I would go back to the question that arose earlier. If you don't want rich people who make money and set up foundations to give it to symphonies, then you ought to tax it away from them up front and give it to the poor people that you're more interested in supporting. But once you have decided, I mean, if you're at all serious about markets in this country, once you've allowed somebody to accumulate money, then to tell them what they do with it is a bad thing, I think, as policy mistake.
I'd add a footnote to that, Don, which is what makes us think that making a decision like that through the tax policy is going to get more money to poor people. When if you look at the record of the government at the state level and at the state levels and the federal levels, all you see is even worse. I mean, look at where we are with respect to tax policy nationally. So the idea that taxing it away is going to be sure that what you save by taxing it away is going to go to poor people is absolutely outrageous. There's no evidence for it at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
I've just got to tell you, because I've gone deja vu all over again. Some years ago, with one of Leslie's trustees, a rich person, very rich person, meeting with it's important to tell you because he clearly, and an extremely well-meaning person, was burdened with every stereotype. But we were meeting with an African-American female community organizer. And he was very distressed that the foundation had just made a grant in the arts. And he looked at this woman and said, "What do you think about us rich foundation people making this grant to the arts when there are poor people in North Carolina?" And she pointed her finger at him and she said, "Mister, don't you ever insult the poor by thinking they live by bread alone."
Good for her.
In fact, the market does support lots and lots of arts. I mean, there's no shortage of movies being made, and well.
And why are they so bad?
And, jazz, for instance, used to be disreputable, and I mean, all new art forms are at first considered to be vulgar, and the old art forms are considered to be more valuable, and over time that changes, and illuminated manuscripts go away, and it's not a viable art form anymore. Now, Lincoln Center has a program in jazz because it's been accepted by the elite.
But the market is not supporting jazz at Lincoln Center. The
No,
Mellon Foundation is, and a few others like that.
But,
and the
if
Circle
novel
Foundation
dies,
and the George Duke Foundation.
comic books replace it or whatever. I mean, it isn't true that our society doesn't support the arts. It just supports some arts a lot more than others. Jay-Z makes plenty of money.
Well, we would have to interrogate this across a wide range of activities. The market takes care of some kinds of things. It certainly doesn't take care of many other kinds of things that thoughtful people have thought worth preserving. Let's put it that way. Partly it's a question of cost structure, so it's not unlike university problems. You've got, it takes 100 people to have a symphony orchestra, and costs go up faster than revenues, and ticket prices are going up too fast as it is. The private sector, corporate philanthropy is in serious decline, and especially in the arts. And the only corporate support for the arts these days typically comes from the marketing side of the house, and it's looking for brand placement and that kind of thing. It's not because there is a belief in the private corporate sector that these things are worth supporting. There are certain kinds of arts which, I think one of the problems with music, for example, is music has never been a good hedge against inflation. So, certain kinds of painting and visual arts, you can hang it on your wall and watch it appreciate and invite your friends over to see it in the meantime. And then, but you can't do that with somebody's latest symphony. The difference between mass culture and high culture is another thing you'd have to ask about there. That's not a boundary that it's easy to make, and I would resist making it. But the fact of the matter is, the blockbuster movies that are made these days at outrageous expense, and they don't always make money. It's a terrible business to be in my view. But I think there would be a lot of thoughtful people who would tell you that a lot of those movies are quite terrible, and that you wouldn't want 1,000 years from now for people to look back and say, "Oh, I see what these people were like."
The archives, digitized archives. Ms. Goggin, you had a question?
Yes, our foundation, the Fletcher Foundation, started off in the arts and had an opera company, and we actually moved our opera company to the School of the Arts with money to follow for 10 years. And then I moved it into social justice. But what I have grown to think about, and we're not as big a foundation as these others, is that it's policy in social justice where I have found my comfort level of the changes that can be made by changing policy and putting money into groups, that's what they're doing, because I agree, I mean, and we do put some money into operations, I won't say we don't, but I tend to like, and it's a long-time strategy, because it takes a long time to change policy. But now, there aren't that many foundations that want to do that. So, you know, there are more foundations. I mean, Z. Smith Reynolds is one of a few that is into policy. But there are more that like to give to the Band-Aid of the thing, but don't want to put anything into policy. And this is particularly when you're talking about the people without a voice. Is that that is where, if we're going to change, if foundations really want to make an impact, you're right, the dollars, these people aren't going to see. They're not going to see, they don't even know what's going on in the market, or they don't know any of this right now. But they're going to feel the impact here if we don't do some things with immigration and different issues to change policy. And I just, you know, so that's where I'm wanting foundations to think about impacting. More foundations doing so regardless of their size.
I'm for the activity. I mean, I salute you. The country needs it desperately. The country also needs an intellectual and cultural life, too. And that's the business we happen to be in, though I am as distressed about income distribution in this country as I can possibly be.
And there are less people, less foundations, and less people who have that interest in changing policy for people without a voice. It's not a fair share, you know, if you look at foundations, and we do this, we do this, we do this, changing policy for people without a voice will come way down here in the list. And, you know, it frustrates me because I feel that's where that we really need to be with this population. Like you said, I mean, in a joking way, but still, poor people, they need policy change. Oftentimes, it's a policy that's happening. That'll keep them down, not other, they don't need any handouts. That's not what they want, or even need.
Barbara, if it's any consolation, I do think that there are more foundations that are focusing on the marginalized Americans, the ones without resources today, and really employing, undertaking efforts to change the policies that bring that about. I mean, you look at the changes that Luis Ubiñas, the president of the Ford Foundation, is making there, which is really sharpening the focus on just that population and using increasingly policy advocacy as a way of doing it. That's not new for Ford, but he's coming down to speak here in January. And it's not, I mean, Hewlett is doing the same thing, Packard is doing the same thing. A number of the major foundations which did not do policy before and which did not focus as precisely on the less well-off in society are now doing it. And my sense is that there are going to be even more of them doing it.
Although it's a little bit
And Atlantic, of course, is really, I'm sorry, what?
It's a little bit perverse that the tax law actually limits the amount you can spend
On
on
advocacy.
lobbying, but not the amount you can spend on symphonies.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that.
Don't tell Grassley about that.
Kate B. Reynolds has never been in policy, but they are thinking about it, and recently they came to us about a grant, a matching grant that they had for HIV/AIDS, of which I was very interested in. But I wanted to use that grant. I mean, it wasn't that significant amount of money, and let's do policy change. No. I mean, we don't do that, and we have Duke research, and we have this group and that group, and no, it has to go into this, it cannot go into policy. And so they just rejected our money and said, no, we're not doing that. And so I said, well, we're not playing.
Well,
So,
the Pew Trusts reorganized themselves so as to be able to lobby.
We're going to close. I just want to make one comment and maybe a suggestion. When I came into the field as a nonprofit person 30 years ago maybe, the point of views that you were expressing were much, much more prevalent than they are today. And I'm speaking in the best of senses, taking the long view, how will you know? And so people are willing to trust instinct and, as well as good due diligence in order to come out in the right place. Certainly in the last 3 decades, times have changed. But here's the suggestion. If Joel and I have talked over the last several weeks about starting an occasional paper series here at Duke. And if you can spare the time to write us an occasional
No
paper,
good deed goes unpunished.
so that the perspective that you're taking really has a larger voice than what it has now, and a deservedly important voice, we'd be interested in knowing.
I like that. I second that enthusiastic.
Well, I'll send you my essay from each of our last 2 annual reports, which plow some of this ground, and you can decide whether we could make something out of that soup.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much. And,
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Great. Thank you very much. Great to be here.